Hey guys, how's it going? We're going to be doing chapter 4 of Athol Fugard's Tsotsi today. And so we begin. When he darkened the doorway, stepping out of the Saturday street and into the odorous world of Ramadullah, general dealer, to stand quietly beside the bags of beans and millie meal, Kasim had hopes of selling a few yards of 1 11-penny printed calico to a woman. "Flowers," he had said, "pretty flowers," and unrolled the bolt of gaudy material. "How much?" she had asked. "Cheap," he said. She fingered it. "Feel it," he said. "Pretty flowers, and it's going cheap." They had kept that up for half an hour. There were variations, of course. Were the colours fast? They were as fast, Mamma, as 2 and 6 pence. "Let me 2 and 6 pence." So Kasim took that bolt down, but in the end their attention reverted to the 1 and 11-penny a yard. Half an hour was a good sign. He had hopes. Then his doorway had darkened, and the young man was there, pretending he wasn't, standing beside the beans and the millie meal. Kasim looked quickly around the shop. There was himself and the woman he was serving, and the 2 other men whom his wife was serving at the end of the shop. At that moment, another man with 2 children hanging onto her skirts came in. 8 people altogether. That was enough. "Pretty flowers, Mamma," he said. But he was looking at the young man. He didn't see the man. He saw the type, the slim, cool types of the street corners and the dice rings, the shebeen boys, the bad eggs. He liked that expression because bad eggs really were offensive to his thin, sensitive nostrils. 2 yards, said the woman. Kasim sighed. He had hoped for 3. He measured the material out on the yardstick nailed to the counter. He wrapped it up in brown paper. She paid. He gave her change. When he looked again, the young man had gone. "Did you see that one?" he called out bravely to his wife, with a nod in the direction of the bags of millie meal and beans. "God forgive us," she said. She was a nervous woman. That was at 9:30. At 10 o'clock he was back again. Standing at the same place, pretending he wasn't there. This time Kasim was frightened. There was only an old man in the shop buying a ticky plug of chew tobacco. He hurried round to his wife, who was serving that old man. She looked at her husband with frightened eyes. "Give him an extra inch," Kasim said to her in Tamil. "Talk to him." His wife cut off an extra inch and put it in the corner beside the ticky length. The old man shook his head and smiled. "Ticky," he said. He had a donkey cart and scoured the veldt for firewood, which he sold in the location sometimes there was no firewood. "For you," Kasim's wife said. The old man, still smiling, held up the small coin to show it to her. "Only ticky," he said. Kasim pushed his wife aside. "It's a present, old man." "For me? For you? For what?" "My respect," Kasim said. "My present for my respect for you, being an old man." Once started, Kasim couldn't stop. He explained that he had an old mother in India, living in Delhi Street, Bombay. He told him about New Delhi Street, about India. He gave a short discourse on its history. The old man listened without interrupting. He listened patiently, because that was the way of his kind, but inwardly he thought the Indian man was sorely mad. He was talking so much the sweat was on his forehead. What was he talking about? And why didn't he stop? Kasim did eventually. Somebody else came into the shop, and the young man left again, not once having moved from the bags of meal and beans. Kasim called out to his wife, in a voice that was still a little bit braver. "I fixed him. God forgive us," his wife said. "What did he want?" Kasim asked aloud, just standing there. His wife was talking about Durban and going back. She had been born there. She always talked about Durban when times were bad or there was trouble. "You know something," Kasim said. "I think he's mad." He laughed. It was a brave attempt at a brave sound. It was 11 o'clock. He came again at 11:30, and this time there was nothing Kasim could do. They were alone. His wife disappeared into the back room, where he heard her call all the children together. Then there was a series of door slams and business with keys as she retreated into the deepest room of the house. Kasim remained at the counter. He took a deep breath and waited. "I can still scream," he thought. The young man came straight to the counter where Kasim stood with his eyes averted. "Yes?" he asked, meaning to be calm and cool and to the point with no nonsense. Young man, but his tongue had a lungful of air behind it, with the result that he found himself saying yes for fully 5 seconds. He stopped in time to hear himself fart. "It's wind, you see," he always said. "A windy bowel." At that moment, neither the thought nor the explanation occurred to him. The young man was facing him, and with prayers and inward tears, Kasim was waiting for the first syllable of trouble. "Yes, yes, 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 yes. Milk." Kasim wanted to laugh. He almost collapsed under the hysterical desire to laugh. What sounds like milk, he thought. I've heard wrongly. Milk, bilk, kilk, shrilk, rilk, wilk, silk, milk. A second time he said it. Clear and strong and no mistakes. Kasim looked up. Milk? Later in the day, he found he could not remember the face, not even the clothes the young man had worn, because now, when he looked, his eyes, frightened and blind with fear, moved so fast from feature to feature that he saw nothing. "Ja, milk!" And this time there was anger and impatience, so much of both, so clear, that with an effort Kasim pulled himself together and found something else to say. "But what sort of milk?" "Baby milk." Yes, yes, yes. I see. Baby milk." And with another fart, Kasim tore himself away from the counter and disappeared, running through all the rooms and doors to the last, which was locked and behind which his wife was cowering with his children. Kasim dropped to his knees and whispered, "Baby milk! Baby milk!" But his wife, thinking that Kasim had just been knived, started crying, and the children joined in. Without knowing it, they saved the day, because hearing them, Kasim remembered, wiped away his tears, and ran back to the shop. The young man was still there, still alone. "You mean condensed milk?" Cassim cried. He saw the young man hesitate, and a frown pucker his eyebrows. "I've got him," he thought. "By God, I've got him." Yes, you mean condensed milk." And before the man could think enough to answer or argue, Cassim had the tin down from the shelf and on the counter. "1 and 4 pence halfpenny," Cassim said, being careful to phrase his words as if it might just interest the other to know the price. The young man was still hesitant, and made the mistake of picking up the tin and scrutinizing the label. He couldn't read, and Cassim realized this. "Very good, baby milk." He paid Cassim, who gave him back the correct change, being very careful to be very correct, and then he left the shop. Tsotsi stood outside the shop. He stopped deliberately, forcing himself to do so, and looked at the tin of condensed milk, rolling it from hand to hand. "I'm looking at it," he said to himself. "I'm looking at this tin I've just bought. I don't give a damn about nobody." But he didn't see it. He was conscious of his back and of Cassim's eyes behind it, watching him. For that matter, he hadn't seen Cassim either, or his wife, or anything else in the shop. Buying baby's milk, it hadn't sounded right. He hadn't heard anyone say a thing like that before. When he had paused long enough to prove that he didn't give a damn, he turned left on the pavement and walked his way, and not once did he look back. He would have liked to run, to get away as quickly as possible from the shop and the 2 frustrating hours he had waited. Twice he had tried just to go in and ask, but each time he had got as far as 2 steps inside the door and no further. Buying baby milk? It didn't sound right. 2 hours, until at last the shop was empty. Now he wanted to run, but again, forcing himself, he kept walking. But at first, he didn't see the street either. But C. Ramabula General Dealer was a long way from his room. He hadn't chosen it for that reason. And a few minutes after leaving the shop, he felt better. No one was watching. No one was laughing. No one had pointed as he passed and shouted, "Here's the man who bought baby's milk." He looked around and registered the time and place. It was the Saturday street. The street had as many names as there were days in the week, and as many as there were hours in the day. Saturday had one profound meaning. You had got past Friday. You were still alive. After this came the other meanings. You had money in your pocket. Tomorrow was Sunday, and that meant no work. You could live late today and sleep late tomorrow. So you put on your best, you jingled your coins, and you lounged about the corners, watching the girls, arm in arm, flaunting their skirts the length of the street. That was the Saturday street. Lots of people, come today, gone tomorrow, very hot, making up now for the banshee time around midnight when Saturday night would reach its climax. Tsotsi saw it very quickly and closed his mind to it. He had seen it all before. Free of the embarrassment and humiliation he had felt in buying the milk, he was free now to hurry without loss of pride. He skipped the tin to his coat pocket and pushed forward. People felt safe in the daylight, and that made it harder to move through the crowd on the pavement. On Fridays they opened up and made a path for him. When he reached his room, he was sweating. He closed the door behind him, putting a chair against it so no one could enter unexpectedly. The window, or rather the hole in the wall, since there was no glass, he covered up with the thin square wood which he used for that purpose when it was cold or raining and the wind blew. Only then, Feeling safe from inquisitive eyes or interruption, did he take the shoebox from its hiding place under the bed. He put it down carefully on the table, pulled up a chair, sat down, and then took off the lid to examine its contents. It was still alive and seemed to be sleeping. A foul, acrid smell rose up from the box, but he didn't notice it because for a moment he was again awed by what he saw. This was man. This small, almost ancient, very useless and abandoned thing was the beginning of a man. It had legs and arms, a head and a body, but even when he allowed for that, he still could not see how this would one day straighten out, smooth and shape itself into manhood. Even asleep, its face was cross-grained with complaint. The head was misshapen. It looked more like an egg. The body was covered with patches of fuzzy hair. When his first surprise was past, Tsotsi noticed the smell. He left the table to fetch an old coat hanging on a nail behind the door, first bundling it up before putting it down. Then, very carefully, he took the baby out of the box and put it down on the coat. He was proud of that, the idea to use the coat. The baby looked better resting on it than it would have on the bare, bottle-stained tabletop. Catching himself with a feeling of pride, he frowned, pursed his lips, and worked on. Apart from a stain on the bottom of the box, was still all right. Which meant the smell was coming from the baby. He examined it. The smell was coming from its clothes, the rags in which it was wrapped. Where Tsotsi hesitated, he sat down and wiped away the sweat which had formed a thin moustache on his upper lip. It was hard going. He hadn't done it before. It is more. He didn't know what to do, and was forced to pause and formulate each new phase of action. The next phase had to do with the bad smell and dirty rags. The clothes had to be changed. But how? He would use one of his shirts. Good. He found one on the cardboard box in which he kept a few oddments of clothing. He began to unfold the rags in which the baby was wrapped. They consisted of a torn petticoat and an old pair of blue bloomers. This time, Tsotsi registered a reaction. First distaste, because the smell drifted up onto his face as an almost tangible cloud of malodorousness. Then impatience, and a sweat of panic when the baby, awakened by all the movement, began to cry. It was a shattering loud noise, and it had made him uncertain of his hands. Finally, he was surprised. He stopped what he was doing and looked down in amazement. The baby was a boy. The tiny penis rested like a thin finger on the testicles, and these together were the size of a small walnut. The navel stood out prominently as a convoluted button of flesh. Tsotsi lifted up the baby, and the origin of the smell was obvious. The crusty, egg-yellow liquid stool that had soaked into the rags. Crumbs of it still stuck to the small buttocks. Using a corner of the petticoat, he wiped them clean. When that was finished, he wrapped it up in his shirt and put it back in the box on the bed, where he turned his back on it. There was still a lot to be done. He now took the tin of condensed milk out of his pocket, sat down at the table and examined it. Tsotsi had been seeing that tin, or others like it, for as long as he could remember. Yet now, as it rested on his hand, it was as meaningless, with its label and words, as a book in the language foreign to his own, which he could neither read nor write and only half spoke. Babies needed milk. Even he realized that. When he had got back to his room early that morning with a shoebox, he had tried to give it water and bread soaked in water, but it had all come drivelling out. He knew what it wanted, milk, and if the noise it made was anything to go by, it wanted it bad. So he had gone to the shop, but so uncertain was he of himself that it had taken 2 hours to find the courage to the right moment to ask. When the Indian gave him the condensed milk, he had wanted to argue. Condensed milk? He'd been drinking condensed milk his whole damned life. But the Indian had said it was baby's milk, and had pointed at all the words on the label. Studying them now, Tsotsi found them totally without meaning, and apart from the words, there was only the trademark picture of the 2 birds in the nest with the eggs, in which it didn't help him at all. He looked up at the baby. It was crying again, a hard, worrying noise that made him desperate and uncomfortable. He went to the bed, bending low over the puffed-up knob of a head, shouted, "Tula!" And then a second time, much louder, shaking the mattress with his hands. The baby cried on. If only Boston. No! It was too late now for that thought. He didn't finish it. Tsotsi looked once more at the tin, not at the words this time, just generally at the tin, feeling the weight of it in his hands and the noise of the baby in his ears, and then he decided. Right, you take it like I take it. He spoke aloud. With the decision, he found himself busy again, and that, together with the strong sound of the words, made him feel better. He made 2 holes in the side of the tin, using his knife. Took a quick suck for himself, finding it thick and cloying in the throat, and then waited for a few seconds, while the vicious white fluid slugged into a spoon. The baby took it and stopped crying. When the 1 spoon was finished, he gave it another, and so on until 10 had been slobbered up by the greedy lips. After that, the baby was quiet, and Tsotsi took a rest. He took it standing up at the window, first taking down the piece of wood, and then resting there with his elbows sticking out. It was well into the afternoon now. He knew that if the others, meaning Butcher and Diop, were going to come to him for another job, it would be soon, and if he wasn't careful, he would be caught with the baby. He studied the street. It was night time. It was the right time to do something. It was the Saturday afternoon lull, with most people indoors or sleeping or slipping away the hot hours until the time was long with shadows and the first rhythm of night began to trouble the blood. His problem was the baby in the box, in his room, where it couldn't stay. 2 men, the one with a guitar and idol dropping warm chords as they talked, passed his window. Tsotsi had forged the first link in the reasoning out of his problem. He felt better. It must go someplace else. That was even better. He felt good finding things a little clearer. Now where? Where could he take the shoebox? Suki? Shit, she'd just be full of questions. Where, ma'am? By blue gum trees. By blue gum trees? Yeah, ma'am. But why, man? And how did he answer that? Yeah, why? Himself asking himself now, why? He turned and looked back at the baby. No time for that now. The question was where. Where could he take it? Tsotsi was still at the window, trying to think and finding it hard, when a group of men, laughing at their bare feet and dusty khaki clothes, appeared at a corner and turned into the street. They were one of the demolition squads, busy each day now as they broke down doors and windows and tore off the roofs of a few more houses so that no more people could come into the township. They were being carted away in lorries to some other place, so that one day the township would be no more. Seeing them, Tsotsi had the solution to his problems. The ruins. He would hide the baby in the ruins. There were already large areas of them in the township. They had been picked clean by scavenging children, but were now left alone, as ugly as ulcers on a weak body. Yeah, a ruin. And the best one, because it was the biggest, began not far from his room, near the boundary of the impatient white suburb. Tsotsi put his tin of condensed milk into his pocket, propping the holes first with bits of paper, and then the spoon. And finally he turned to the baby. He replaced the lid, and picked up the box carefully, so as to not disturb its sleep. He opened the door, looked around first, and then stepped into the street, which was still deserted except for the dust of the men who had passed. A child without a game and a dog without a flea. He asked no questions among the fallen walls, neither why they were down and where had the people gone, nor was it right or was it wrong, had they done that, had they done that it had come to this. He didn't need to. They had been asked on that uncertain day, unremembered now because there had been so many like it, when the squad had come with his sledgehammers and crowbars in the first light, and the people had sat sleepy-eyed and bewildered on the pavement. That had been the moment of asking, voiced bitterly or inwardly, wordlessly, to be thrown away unanswered, as much as the debris of that day as the rubble their homes had been reduced to after a few violent minutes of work. Tsotsi passed through doorway to doorway, stepping lightly on the walls that lay as they had fallen in their moment of submission. Those that still stood had been shocked into a dumb, gaping idiocy. Through them he could be seen other ruins, and through those still others, giving a perspective of raw ends and rubble, until it seemed that space itself, the intangible something defined by four walls and a roof, had been broken up and holes knocked in it. Overhead the sky stretched as taut as a blue tarpaulin. It was a good place to hide the baby. They were deserted, except for a few lizards, grown bold in their undisturbed times. The people were gone. Those who had lived there, been born there, gone away as much as those who had died there. The only ones who had returned, and then only briefly, were the children of the other families still in the township. They had come back for a short time, starting when the demolition squad had left, returning to scavenge amongst the bricks, going home in the evening with wood from the broken doors and window frames, which had cooked simple meals in other backyards. They had come back another day, and maybe another after that, to play there and lay the broken bricks in a child's dream of home, with a flower in a bottle and a one-legged doll. But they too forgot one day, because there were no other games, other ruins, and this one had been picked clean. So the sun bleached the walls, the dust settled, and the wind swept it clear of all smells of living. They were odorless as Tsotsi walked through. He chose the old place where Marabatswe had lived with her niece, and lived long, because the beer brewed in that backyard was famous. Marabatsi had grown to a big age, because when the time came to leave her room and climb onto the lorry that she had hired to take her someplace else, they found the door too small for the woman who in 10 years had not left her room because of swollen ankles. The demolition men were forced to take the door away, and part of the wall as well, before the big soul emerged to great cheering and many tears. Her passing down the street and into the distance, statuesque in her chair on the lorry, made real the whisper that one day the township would die. Tsotsi chose this ruin because in one corner there remained an overhang of the corrugated iron that had been the roof, and when he had thought about shade, the baby was still silent, so much so that he opened the lid to look, and was only satisfied when he saw the legs kick. He hid it in the corner together with the condensed milk and spoon, before sitting himself down, back to the wall, to think. Tsotsi knew one thing very definitely now, starting last night, and maybe even before that, because sitting there with a quiet mind to the events of the past hours, it seemed almost as if there might have been a beginning before the blue gum trees. But regardless of where or when, he had started doing things that did not fit into the pattern of his life. There was no doubt about this. The pattern was too simple, too clear, woven as it had been by his own hands, using his knife like a shuttle to carry the red thread of death and interlace it with others stained in equally somber hues. The baby did not belong, and certainly none of the actions that had been forced on him as a result of its presence, like buying baby milk, or feeding it, or cleaning it, or hiding it with more cunning and secrecy than other people hid what they had from him. It had broken into his life with shattering improbability. It was irrelevant, and more than that, it was destructive, tearing open the simple, hand-worked fabric in which he had wrapped his existence so that other irrelevances had begun to blow their cold way in. Why, then, had he taken the baby? This being the time and the place for the question, the end of his logic was death, yet he had saved it. Why? Was there a chosen, special death for it? He would have liked to believe this, because together with the diligence of his clumsy, groping attempts to meet its needs, was resentment. Tsotsi squirmed with anger at the weak hold it had found on its life. Yet, in spite of this, he carried on, stumbling from one moment of inadequacy to the next, swallowing his pride, curbing his impatience, carrying on because he knew very well he had taken it. He was chancing his hand at a game he had never dared play, and the baby was the dice, so to speak. It was surprise that had made him step back, not yet 24 hours ago, when he had the woman under the tree. He had heard babies cry before, but remotely and without attention, hearing them as an off-key undertone in the bigger, bloodier sounds of life. But this one, coming then, the thin discordancies of it drifting up like stale smoke from the holes punched in the lid of the shoebox. Those were so unexpected, so alien to his purpose, and the meaning of that moment, that had startled him. A lot was in the balance. The conspiracy of that night was almost hatched. The women had brought it a step nearer fulfillment when she forced the box into his hands. The baby had taken it further, still crying, because if it had stopped, he would have surely heard the frightened footsteps receding in the night, and that sound would have quickened him like a cat at play. But instead he held the box, heard only the baby, and felt it squirm inside, and inside himself a strange, nameless fear. The last detail in the plot was the lid falling off, because then he saw it, hands adrift in the small boxed world of anemones in a dead sea, the head rolling from side to side, the mouth open like a black hole in its hideous grimace at life, the legs furtive and quick in their kicks as if it still felt like the confines of its mother's womb. That moment, the night was beyond repeal. Suddenly, very sharply, and with more pain than he had ever felt before in his life, light stabbed his darkness, and he remembered. The memory was of a dog, a bitch, a yellow bitch, and he knew definitely, very definitely, that it came crawling towards him. He thought possibly in great pain, but certainly crawling. There was at times even the sound of a whimper as she came crawling slowly, and as he thought, in great pain, crawling almost to him, so very close, so that he could see her eyes, and in them the thought he had of pain. Then, just when it was certain that something was going to happen, the image blurred and faded, and his darkness rolled in. A yellow bitch crawling in pain. That much he could remember, and with a clarity that even the innumerable times he had called it up since the trees had not faded by the slightest detail. A yellow bitch crawling in pain. Nothing had ever been as sharp in its effect on him. No pain, no pleasure, no event in the years since that certain moment when he had found himself alive and inwardly a darkness, keeping it that way until the blue gum trees, when out of the past he knew nothing about, and had wanted to know nothing about, had come a yellow bitch, crawling in great pain. Tsotsi looked up from his memory to find himself on his knees, and before him, on the ground, where it must have slipped out of his hands, the baby still in the shoebox. It was much later then. The moon had risen overhead, and was out of sight behind his back. The trees were silent, because the wind had died away, and even the crickets threw their triple syllables of intermittent, wide intervals. It was still later when he left, because Tsotsi, first of all, had sat back to formulate. Something had happened when he had guarded against a long time. He had remembered. It was a strange memory. It was also ancient, going back further than he had even thought time itself went. The baby had brought it. It was also obvious and easy. The moment he had looked down, almost the exact moment of seeing it, he had remembered. The two were tied up together somehow, the baby and the dog. The next thought took a long time in coming, and when it did, it frightened him. He was curious. This, in its way, was even stranger than the memory, because that had had predecessors in a half-brothered way, like the man who called himself Ptah, and his fear of spiders, and the nostalgia in the smell of wet newspapers. None had ever been so vivid, as terrifying as the memory of the bitch, but they did have to do with his past, but he never been curious. Now he was. He knew his curiosity was a froth of futile questions that came to his lips. He wanted the answers. He wanted the answers very bad, but he did not have them. That was when he decided to take the baby. That was his talisman, his touchstone. It had worked once, working with devastating efficiency. It might work again. He would make it work again. He would wait until it worked again. His determination moved in the shadow of fear. Something urged him to kill the baby and leave it, warning him that he was playing a game he had never dared before. Tsotsi was obsessed now, a long-shot fool who had rolled the dice and had his first win, and then dared the lot because he wanted more. Tsotsi wanted to know everything. So he carried the baby back through the wide streets and the dawn, passing under the first birds as they chattered in the trees, reaching the township at the same time as the sun. The baby would have to be alive to work its alchemy again. For that reason he fed it, and cleaned it, and had now hidden it safely where he could return to it in his time and leisure, and to lure the yellow bitch out of his past. When he left the ruins, he decided to return the next day to feed it again.